Oh, welcome. Thanks for joining us on this Facebook Live. It's part of the DES Action 40th anniversary celebrations. And I'm Fran Howell, and I'm a former executive director of DES Action. And with me is Kari Christiansen, and she's a former board president and also the program director of DES Action when I was the executive director. And Kari is fascinating because she has been with the organization probably longer than anybody else currently here with us these days. Kari, you've been around for 38 of our 40 years. And so we wanted to talk with you a little bit and, use your amazing resource to find out a little bit about how things went all these years and how we've come to be. And
Right.
maybe we should just start briefly with an understanding of what DES is. And you want to help us with that? What is diethylstilbestrol and what were the harms that it might have caused?
Well, DES, diethylstilbestrol, was the first synthetic estrogen that was created, that was given, first created, but it was developed with the idea that it would do hormone replacement therapy or other conditions for women. But it was given to pregnant women with the idea it prevented miscarriage. It doesn't do that. It never did. But it caused harm to the children that those women were pregnant with during that time. So it is a synthetic estrogen, very powerful, much stronger than anything else that is on the market now as an estrogen. And the harms that it caused, certainly the first one that was identified and the one we know some about is the clear cell adenocarcinoma of the vagina and cervix in DES daughters. Next, we learned more about fertility problems and pregnancy problems. The idea that DES would cause miscarriage because of structural defects and changes in the ability to become pregnant and to hold and maintain a pregnancy. As we've gone on over the years, we've learned a little bit more about some of the other conditions, other medical conditions that may be associated with prenatal DES exposure, both in sons and daughters. Also in sons, we should say that DES caused some structural changes for them, but not necessarily a change in fertility. Some DES sons did have testicular cancer, but not to a statistically significant number that they could say there was even a direct association. And I think that's one of the things we want to remember as we're talking about all of the things related to DES. There certainly are markers, particularly structural changes that are markers of DES exposure, like a uterus that's misshapen so it looks like a T on some of them. They call it indeed the T-shaped uterus. But certainly there are things that sons needed to be aware of too, and testicular self-exam, some benign changes like epididymal cysts, but they can cause discomfort from time to time. And so that was important for DES sons as well as DES daughters to let their doctors know as much as they could about it. And I think as time has gone on, we've learned more and more, and we need to continue to learn more.
That was a mouthful. I guess I just asked you a lot, put it all together for us. But DES Action itself as an organization, we literally came together from around the country as word got out of some of the problems that were being caused and the fears and all of the concerns that were being generated from coast to coast. And Kari, you were around when some of those organizations merged into one and became from DES Action Minnesota, DES Action Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., became one.
And I think most often it started on the East and West Coast. And so it was California and New York were the places that, and Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania, where those are the groups that really started it. And it started primarily with DES mothers looking for information for their daughters, but also DES daughters were involved. One of the things that we knew, there was some research going, but there was no information for consumers to come out of that at that time. And so they wanted to have an opportunity to learn what's happening, what are they finding, what's being seen What do we need to know about him? What's going to happen in the future? And this was also at the same time that the women's health movement was very much becoming an active part of what women were doing and advocating for and wanting to know more about their bodies and more about.
And we're talking about the late 70s.
About late 70s and early 80s. And so really DES Action then, those first organizations that were very separate at that time because they started locally, came together, met in New York, and decided we need to be one voice. And so they decided to call themselves DES Action. They did that in 1977 and then organized and became incorporated and started a newsletter almost immediately. In part, it was to keep information about what they were doing in all of those local areas available. But then all of a sudden, here you had a newsletter, you had more people knowing, and everybody wanted to become a part, or at least in more parts of the country. And so that's around the time that I got involved in 1980. It was Joyce Bickler had been the first DES daughter to successfully sue and win litigation as a DES daughter for her clear cell adenocarcinoma. She moved to Minnesota. So not only did she start the DES Action Group, but I got to meet my first DES daughter, who was Joyce Bickler, and then a lot of other DES daughters, and we got together. And that was happening in other parts of the country. And that's what the organization was nurturing and leading and telling us how to be an activist group, telling us what we needed to do in order to reach out in our communities and how we needed to talk with one another.
And it is fascinating because the same concerns and feelings were being held everywhere, but how to do it. And to be able to then take the smaller groups from around the country and coalesce into one, it seems so important. Now you look back on it, it makes so much sense, but it was a tough decision at the time, I understand, because you wanted to have a national presence. You wanted to be able to go to Congress. You wanted to be able to talk to researchers, whereas the groups that were around the country, as I understand it, were trying to educate doctors. They were doing a lot of support, meeting other DES exposed people. But the actual push for funding for research came at the national level.
It did come at the national level, and that was really after about those first 10 or 11 years. We were, as an organization, learning how to talk to one another, how to find one another, how to develop physician lists of doctors that were knowledgeable about DES, how to go into clinics to bring our slideshow, which was developed so that we had an opportunity to really meet and teach and become a part of it. And so we went to a lot of clinics in our areas to take care of that and to do that teaching, to answer questions. But as we and we actually were still writing letters to Congress. We had the DES Awareness Weeks that started in 1983 and 84 and 85. And so that was meant to be both local and national in bringing awareness. And so we were doing DES Awareness Weeks in our own states, but we were also writing to Congress and having that be declared as a DES Awareness Week nationally too.
And so I guess what we're sort of heading towards is what was our mission, and it's been our mission all along, which is to identify, to educate, to empower, and to advocate. And that's where DES Action strengths are and were and have been and probably will be. How many were exposed nationally? And we're just in the United States we're talking about.
Right. Just in the United States, we estimate there were almost 5 million pregnant women given DES who gave birth to children. And that means that there were close to 2.5 million DES daughters and 2.5 million DES sons, meaning close to 10 million DES mothers, daughters, and sons in this country. So it's not a small problem, it's a big one. Not all of our stories and our exposures and how DES affected us is the same, which has always made that a more complex problem, both to research and for us to advocate and understand. And we still don't have complete understanding on that. We know that DES daughters and sons who were exposed earlier in the pregnancy and whose mothers had perhaps larger total doses have the most reproductive tract changes. But that doesn't relate necessarily to something like the clear cell adenocarcinoma. And so it's always been a complex problem that we still are trying to fully understand and learn. And the fact that, as we've learned with all endocrine disruptors, they are the gifts that keep on giving. You can't not be DES exposed once you're DES exposed. And so that was part of what we as an organization always needed to bring to the forefront, that we're not going away. And we can't go away, unfortunately.
But yet, too, research is getting increasingly difficult to do, to actually identify an association. We never say there's a cause. We never say
No.
DES caused this. We always say there's an association, because there's still just that little bit of unknown. But now we've got people, I know in my case, I took birth control. And my mother used to scream at me about that. It's like, why are you adding an extra hormone? And I say, oh, don't worry, Mom, you're worrying too much. And it turns out then, of course, I had to have infertility treatments, which were unsuccessful when we adopted our daughter, and the world became good again for me. But that was an additional exposure. And so layers of exposures of all sorts of hormones, including the air we breathe, the environments we live in, are full of endocrine disruptors now.
Right.
And so teasing out a DES cause may be tough. It's sort of frustrating, but research has to continue.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly where DES and the DES exposed population have been really helpful to more than just understanding DES or attempting to understand DES exposure. The fact that we are the human population identified, particularly through the National Cancer Institute DES follow-up study, of which those participants are the vast majority documented, not only with dates starting when they're in the mother's pregnancy, but the total dosage. And the fact that and the fact that there are matched control participants who are not DES exposed, so that you really have a good comparison of what can happen. But always you're going to have the potential of a layering of exposures. Genetics are different. All of these parts that we don't necessarily are able always to understand as to how that association, how it works in one way and not necessarily with one person and not with the next person.
But that study, sort of the NCI, National Cancer Institute DES follow-up studies, is sort of the gold standard for studies.
Very much so. It is one that's looked at throughout the world in understanding DES, and is used not only in our country in that, but by researchers who have been continuing to do it too. Comparison, not that there aren't other cohorts or other groups of participants that have been and they have been gathered in other parts of the country, but the documentation is not as secure with them. Sometimes they rely on memory more, and the nice thing about the DES follow-up study is that there is so much documentation from our mother's records.
Now, shouldn't we be really proud of that? Didn't DES Action play a part in getting that funded?
You know, absolutely. The follow-up part, there was, starting in 1975, the National Cancer Institute did follow what was called the DESAD project, the DES Adenosis project. And that went on through the 1980s. And it was really at that time, and we talked about how our focus maybe changed a little bit at an organization. And it was because National Cancer Institute was looking and thinking, maybe we need to start, letting go a little of this, or winding down with this particular research. It's been close to 15 years. And we heard about that as DES Action, and we were very, very concerned. We were still feeling and finding concerns and questions that we had about what needed to be happening as far as what we were looking for. And so it was really at that time that that a lot of how we had been functioning as a national organization transitioned, so that it really was at least certainly our staff time, but also our volunteer time across the country was then more focused on the letter writing and contacting our legislators, our people in Congress.
Let's play off that for a minute. The idea of the letter writing, back when DES Action started, it's hard to imagine. It feels like in the good old days or something, because there was no email and there was no internet. And how do you communicate with an organization and with other people? Get them to, and our members were so good about participating in this advocacy.
Right, and they really have been over the decades. Yes. I think that's one of the things. But certainly as an organization, we relied on telephone and letter, and that was it. There, and you just waited for the mail. I mean, when I contacted DES Action, I wrote a letter in 1980 or 79 or 80, saying that I'm a DES daughter and I've known since 1972 and I've never met another DES daughter, and you know, I can't believe it. And now I've just found out there's DES Action. Thank you, Joyce. And so and I got a letter back from Pat Cody, who was the first program director of DES Action and co-founder of DES Action, and a DES mother. And she said, "Don't beat yourself up. Now just, you know, start doing something."
Pat was good at getting us involved in
Yes.
doing things. She just expected, you know,
we
would all want to get out there and do it. And
yeah.
She helped focus us to keep our interest. But before we talk a little bit about Pat, I just wanted to remind everybody that this is the DES Action Facebook Live, and we're celebrating our 40th anniversary as an organization. And you're watching Fran Howell and Kari Christiansen, the former program director, and I was the former executive director at one point of DES Action. And we're pretty proud of our organization and what it's done.
Very much so. And I have to say at this point that this is sort of Fran and I together again for the first time, and that we didn't get to, when we worked in the organization, we weren't in one office. We were hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles apart. And so this is a rare treat that Fran and I get to sit side by side and talk about DES Action. The only other times it would happen is twice a year at 4 board meetings.
That's really true. People think of it as an office, when in fact we did have our we always talked about our cubby holes.
Yes,
you know,
our cubicle walls.
Cubicle walls being so high, and that included going from Minnesota to Florida. But thanks to that kind of communication, the email and the cell phones, we were able to do that.
Certainly during the time that we were the staff people.
But that's what's so funny, is that flow of information. I can't even imagine copying and doing the voice newsletter, even just, you know, running off copies of it, or sending out letters, looking for stamps. I did not use too many stamps, because honestly we did communicate on the website and the Facebook page and things, and I guess I felt very lucky about that.
Right.
It was more instant, and there it was back in the good old days. You guys really had to work at it.
Well, it was just a different way. We didn't know we were having to work at it, because that's how everybody worked.
That's true.
And so
true.
We were not the only people, and that was how every other organization and business was run at the same time. So it felt normal to us. And what felt good to us is that we had to write letters, we had to answer the phone, that there were people reaching out and wanting information. And so that's the part that kept us going, not the fact that we think, oh, this is so laborious.
That's true too. Yeah. And every time the media did a story, TV or magazine or newspaper, I guess you would know what part of the country it aired on, because you would get all these calls and requests for information from those particular parts of the country.
That's right. That's right. And then there actually started to be some more national broadcasts, certainly around the same time that the Minnesota group was developing in January of 1980 is when the Lou Grant Show aired, and had part of its segment about Billy Newman being a DES daughter and looking for the records. Right. And that made a huge impression, and it also made it much easier for us in Minnesota to find office space, and you know, just because oh, I saw a TV show about that.
Lou Grant was a very popular
Yeah.
series at one point,
Yes.
and that couldn't have been better publicity. And didn't Pat help?
Pat definitely helped. She went to Hollywood, met with the producers and the writers, and was very proud that they used verbatim some of the words that she had given
In
them
the script.
in the script. So, but certainly the sensibility of that show, and the fear and the anger and the frustration that the DES daughter character had was all certainly something that we were all familiar with as DES daughters.
That is so true. Part of what I think of, we always think of the medical issues that we deal with, but there's also the emotional ones, and each of us have to deal with them differently. A lot of the stress often the stressor points came between mothers and daughters, and sometimes I would get emails. I primarily handled the emails. Kari primarily during our time handled the phone calls. People were concerned. They were several people, and this is perfectly understandable, would blame their mother for taking this drug, and we had to, while they were pregnant, and we had to talk that through. How you did not have the internet at that time. You couldn't go look it up. Doctors were gods. They gave you a pill bottle or told you to get it at the pharmacy, and that was what you took. And there was still people upset about it. And then you turn it around and you go, but look, what if there had been a wonder drug and your mother had decided for whatever reason not to take it? Right. There might not have been the outcome that there was. So you just follow doctor's orders. But those there was a lot of pain in families. I know my parents were upset about it, and I did have to talk to my mom a little bit that way about, you took this drug, and at that time she took shots, which were painful, I'm told, and pills, and those pills were expensive, and they didn't have a lot of money, and so they put everything into those pills, this wonder drug. Right. And I look at it now as she loved me so much, she wanted to have me. Right. And that was the way I sort of tried to phrase that, because we were a support group also. And like Kari, I was in my 40s when I met my first DES daughter, who happened to be Kari, because I did move to Minnesota and lived there for a few years. And shout out to Molly, who had told me on a listserv at one point, hey, you're moving to where Kari lives, you're so lucky. And I certainly was. But that was fun to me. I'll bet most DES daughters and sons even have grandchildren, have not met a DES exposed person that they know of. We're out there with 10 million people out there. We're out there, but you cannot look at me and see that I'm DES exposed.
No, that's the difference with the kind of exposure we had, which has always made it probably more difficult to maintain interest, certainly in the medical community, is that because by and large we look the same and all, unless our doctor is familiar with the kinds of issues related, particularly fertility and reproductive, but also maybe now other health issues as we're becoming more aware of that, maybe more cardiovascular disease, those kinds of things that need more study, and we'd be happy to. And we haven't even talked about third generation and that fact, or and if there's anything additional for sons, which certainly those cardiovascular and some of those, that's both sons and daughters they're talking about. But whether or not there is a direct association, or if it's this is just something that's anecdotally kind of coming in because we're all reaching in age. But at this stage, it's a higher incidence among the DES exposed population in the NCI DES follow-up study than there is of the unexposed participants.
Well, and again, just also talking about doctors, that's something that DES, you brought in the medical profession, that DES action did such a good job on for so long and continues to really work on, is having a doctor list state by state, so you could go to a doctor who understood or knew about DES exposure. However, as years have gone by, it's become frustratingly difficult because so many of those doctors have retired and passed away. And so DES Action, again, had to evolve a little bit in its thinking and say, hey, no one's going to take care of you except you. So here on our website, you can download information about DES exposure and the screenings that you need to bring to your doctor. And we were talking about this earlier, that the idea of finding a doctor who knows about DES exposure, tough. So what you might want to do is ask around, ask your neighbors, your family members, your friends, who do you go to? Do you have a doctor that listens to you, that cares about your concerns and takes them seriously? And once you've found that doctor, then use information from DES Action to help them help you.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's something we always had done, particularly for DES daughters and for DES sons, in areas where there wasn't someone that we could identify. While we had affiliates in many states for much of the time, it wasn't in every state. And so we needed to look to tell people how to advocate for themselves if there wasn't anyone on our list. And that's exactly what happens. One of the other things is that DES Action was always very involved then when we were looking at the loss of funding of the research and then going to Congress and wanting to make sure that our needs, our research needs were at least not being forgotten. And as it turned out, at that same time, there were three people in Congress who had asked the National Institutes of Health to see what's going on with women's health research. And what kind of, and so the General Accounting Office of the government did an assessment of the kinds of research that was being done by the National Institutes of Health. And lo and behold, it ended up that only 14% of all research was addressing women's health issues. And DES and the DESAD project was one of those that was going to be eliminated besides that. So that really gave us a powerful voice to go into Congress and say, here we are, don't let us be lost. You're learning too much and there's still too much to be learned. And actually the National Institutes of Health, in response to that, started the Office of Research on Women's Health and reached out to us right away, and as we did to them, and say, we need to meet. And so because of that, and because we already had started initiated through our wonderful advocates in Congress, Louise Slaughter in the House and Tom Harkin in the Senate, we had introduced a bill to the DES Education and Research Amendments of 1992, which passed in 1992. And that really set up the refunding of that and the start of developing an education campaign. Because of that passing of the legislation, the National Cancer Institute reformed and brought in even more cohorts of what now we know of as the premier DES follow-up study of the National Cancer Institute. And that is ongoing and continues to this day, happily.
And I want to tie into that a little bit, because that's so strong. Advocacy with a capital A is what DES Action does for the DES exposed to. Individually, we may not have a voice, but combined,
yes,
we have a voice. And the story, pulling back the curtain a little bit on something that was done in 1996 fascinates me still. I was not really involved at the time, but Kari was. And what had happened, there was going to be this honorarium.
There was an honor or a supposed honor, and actually it was the three people in Congress that had asked the General Accounting Office to investigate how much women's research there was. And there was another organization that was entirely funded by 23 drug companies, which had in its name Women's Health Research. And they were going to give awards for people who had done a lot in women's health research. And we were just very concerned and frustrated that these wonderful three people in Congress who had started and really helped us have an even stronger voice about women's health research were going to be accepting these awards. And so, from
what was a sham organization,
right, exactly,
funded by drug companies.
Right.
What a great way to try to, can I use the word suck up to congressional people to say, hey, look, and when we heard about that as an organization, we didn't take that sitting down.
No, but we wanted to make sure that those people that really were advocates in Congress for women's health research knew what they were getting into.
Well, what did we do?
Well, we did a lot of letter writing. and it didn't matter what, I mean, we still use letters in those days. But we also, and as it turned out, when those people from Congress found out, they backed out, and they refused to go to that. Right.
What we did is then contact them and say, look,
Yes.
Here's the truth about this group that wants to give you a dinner and honor you with a plaque. So we're asking you, do not accept that.
Mm-hmm.
And people from all around the country who were part of DES Action got together and flooded those offices with letters.
Flooded the offices with letters, and there were other awards that were still going on. And so about 35 DES Action members and activists were outside picketing at the time, saying that, this organization does not represent women. It represents the drug companies. You're supporting the drug companies by even attending this event. And so that actually
What happened? Did those 3 who were getting awards?
Oh, they declined it, and they did not. They were not there. They turned it back in, or said we will not appear.
They RSVP'd and said no way.
Yes, right. But
I'm so glad about that, and it's fun to see how our members could come together when we needed help. Our volunteers, our members
together very quickly. Yes, absolutely.
But we were able to rise up and be heard.
Yes.
Yeah. You were part of that then.
Well, I didn't pick it. I was in Minnesota and they were in Washington, unfortunately. I wanted to be there, but indeed that was part of what we do. One of the other things I have to say is that we have always worked well with other women's organizations that don't take money from pharmaceutical industry, of which, by the way, there have always been very few. And that would be, there have been over the years, but the National Women's Health Network and our bodies ourselves were the ones that we really relied on primarily. And National Women's Health Network being in Washington, D.C., they really were our ear to Congress, and we would often contact them first to say, who should we talk to about this? Who in this representative or senator's office would be the person to go to? And they always knew and were helpful, and sometimes even would go with us. Or they say, Public Citizen was the other organization that was just amazingly involved, literally from day one, from the early to mid 70s when DES was first. Sidney Wolfe, who was the director of the Health Research Group of Public Citizen, was one of the most amazingly strong advocates, and
sat around Pat's table in the dining room together and worked on some of the issues.
Yeah,
together.
very much so.
Yeah.
And some of us had the great chance in 1996 to do that also. With Pat and I were there with Sydney and went around with Sid and doing some advocacy around other issues that were of concern to our population and to other consumer organizations.
And speaking, I sort of tying into that, if you will, the way DES Action worked is we demanded a seat at the table. We, as consumers, as exposed individuals, we call ourselves consumers, not victims, certainly.
Right.
And I guess it wasn't normal for that voice to be heard at all, that
No.
researchers did their thing and regulators and Congress did their thing and never heard from consumers.
Right. And I think that's something that we had to buck against throughout the time. I know in 1985 we actually had funding to bring together researchers that were at that point part of the DESAD project, as well as those doing animal research at the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. And so we had our first research conference, sponsored by DES Action. There weren't consumers there except for a few of us, and I was president at that time, but Pat Cody was there, Nancy Ades, who was our executive director at that time, and a couple of other of our local San Francisco people who had been writing some of our consumer information. and bringing those people into the same room. So that wasn't exactly what you were talking about, but it started a conversation, and started trying to build trust. And I think there's not necessarily a complete support of particularly in the medical community of people having a voice about their own medical care or asking questions, and certainly not at that time. We were very much bucking a trend at that time, and so it started a conversation as we moved. And I honestly think we didn't really get there until the mid 1990s. And then more seats at the table. Certainly the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences started recognizing, as soon as DES Action was formed, that, oh, here's someone, and invited Pat Cody to come to a conference every once in a while.
Which was not the norm at all. And didn't, as I understand it, other groups than activist groups, we were the model for them in their efforts then, that were also have been over the years quite successful.
Yes, in the 90s, that's what we were hearing. And we started seeing more people like us walking the halls of Congress and talking to our representatives and senators and directly, but also listening to the organizations and that kind of thing. The other part is that because of the kind of communication that we wanted to have with the research community too, we were sharing the stories of what our members were experiencing around their health, around reproduction, around recurrences of the cancer or metastases of cancer. And so all of those stories we shared with those that we thought would be of interest.
Well, without us, they wouldn't have known. They'd be in their labs doing research, animal and human, and we were the face of what was really happening.
Well, and sometimes it gave the opportunity, even certainly among those doing the human researches, that they were asking questionnaires, sending questionnaires and receiving them back and forth. But we sometimes would hear things sooner because we had a broader age range often in population. And one of the things that we discovered is that age can sometimes make a difference, both with an incidence of something unusual, which may or may not be DES related, but or problems that are coming up that we're hearing a lot about, not unlike breast cancer. That was one of the first things that we heard a lot about from DES daughters, young DES daughters, and that was concerning to us. And so we wanted to make sure the research community knew about it.
We saw these things happening in our groups. And the one thing I think the researchers did trust us, because if you read our newsletter, we never put anything in there. We never went public with anything that wasn't peer-reviewed, journal-reviewed, and they respected that. A lot of grassroots organizations go on the web and find some .com somewhere and say this is what's really happening. And we ended up being respected by researchers, and Pat was really good at that too. She could talk layman's talk, and she could talk research talk.
She really could. There's no one like Pat Cody ever, and so she really was the one who wanted to make sure that not only were we using and citing peer-reviewed, but we really were doing a full citation so that everybody knew where everything came from and could go whether to their library and eventually sometimes online, but certainly to PubMed to see the abstract of anything that we talked about or printed in our voice.
And sometimes that got us in some hot water with people who said, look here, I've got this study. And they wanted us to publish it. They wanted us to talk about it. They said, this is it. DES is connected with this. DES caused my name that condition. And we were very careful about not doing that. And people were angry, but we felt that our reputation was on the line to stay with valid research.
Right, and accurate information as best we could do, not meaning to dismiss any of those other concerns, but the fact that what we really, when we said education, we really wanted it to be a valid, something that could be confirmed or at least reproduce. I mean, the idea is that when you do peer review, that there is the potential that research then will be reproduced in a way that will be understood also. So it was always difficult because we wanted to, and we did listen to everyone. We just weren't able to publish everything.
Sometimes that's what people wanted. Again, you would talk to somebody and they go, "Oh, you're a DES daughter, you understand." And there is something about that, about actually meeting someone who's exposed, and the feelings, the concerns, the fears, they're all there. Some people talked about, there are different people too who worry differently. It's like, I never really thought of DES health issues as going to be that big a deal in my life, although I did have infertility and I did have breast cancer and things like that. But it never felt like what some people describe as a ticking time bomb. But that's okay, because that's the way you feel. And you want to talk to someone about it. And it's just as valid a feeling as mine, who I was sort of going, "Mom, you're overreacting. Quit worrying about it." She kept me on the DES Action member list for years every time I moved, which was fairly often. I kept getting that voice newsletter, and I was like, "Mom, did you call the office and give them my new address?" Well, of course. Those poor people. I was telling Kari the other day, I think, under my name, because it was not in a computer at that time, they must have started writing it in pencil. My address changed so many times. But Mom felt she felt it was very important for me especially. And then when I started dealing with infertility, all of a sudden I go, "Oh, that newsletter. There was something in that newsletter. Maybe I should start reading it." And that's when I became more involved.
Right. It's interesting. Up until the time you became more involved, it was your mother who was the activist.
Yes.
And I think that's often what we found, and what Paz used to say is that most often in families there's one activist. Sometimes it's the mother, sometimes it's the daughter, and sometimes it's the son. But not always. We always had a much more difficult time in finding and retaining DES sons. There, no matter what, the culture was not supportive of men talking about health issues, and certainly not publicly, and anything to do with the genital or reproductive tract was not anything that most sons were willing to share. My brother's DES exposed, so I know firsthand that was the case. That he was like, "No, that's your thing. I'm happy and tell me but I need to know, but I can't talk publicly."
That's the one thing I always did feel badly about, that we couldn't bring more sons into the equation. There weren't quite as many health issues perhaps identified. Maybe there would have been more if we'd had more sons involved. I don't know. I kind of doubt it.
But certainly there has always been the research component as part of the National Cancer Institute DES follow-up study. That's one of the things we haven't talked about, and we need to, because we don't have a whole lot to say, is that there is a third generation also being studied in the DES follow-up study. And for me, my brother does have 2 daughters, and that is my third generation, because I was not able to have children. And so those are the kinds of reasons and needs that we still have as a community, as we're looking at understanding not only DES exposure, but how it continues and what changes and what we need to be looking for.
That is a reason for DES Action to continue on and be supported, I think, because without DES Action, I firmly believe the whole issue would have been swept under the carpet. The drug companies desperately wanted us to go away, and we didn't. We stood up to them. And the whole idea of, I might have been dealing with my infertility on my own. You might have been dealing with your issues. Folks out there dealing with their issues all by themselves, not making the connection. And that's why I think over time we have done so much in terms of not letting this issue go away. The DES Action, there's something about it when you think about what would have happened if we weren't here.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Well, on that note, we've run out of time talking about something that really is so dear to me, and that's DES Action, the organization. And so thank you, Kari, our former program director, for being here with us today and joining me, Fran Howell, in this Facebook Live to celebrate 40 years of action, which is without a doubt pretty impressive. Not that many organizations that percolated up at the time are still around, keeping a focus on what they had started doing. So thank you to you, and it's been really fun. And you know, I always think information is power when it comes to DES exposure, and certainly that need is never going away.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.